Hello again. Talk of decolonising the museums and institutions of Britain proceeds apace. The Benin Bronzes are the latest things to be talked about. By the by, they're mostly made of brass rather than bronze, but I suppose that the Benin Brasses might have other connotations. Brass being an old English colloquialism for a certain type of woman. Many of these brass objects, which include plaques and busts, are in the British Museum in London, and they are as keen as mustard to hand them over to Nigeria. I give a link to the British Museum's official view on the matter about the city of Benin, from whence they came, and it is a masterpiece of disinformation. People ask why I talk about this sort of thing and whether I'm obsessed with black people. No, I'm interested in history, and I see fake history so much, and I feel an inclination to dismantle it. And an awful lot of the fake history now centres around black people and colonialism and the British Empire and so on. Anyway, I'll give a link in the description to this video to the British Museum's account of Benin in the 19th century. We are told that this period of West African history was also significantly affected by the transatlantic slave trade. This vast traffic in humans supplied labour to the colonies and plantations in the Americas, including those of Britain. While by the late 19th century this trade had been largely abolished, its increasing scale and barbarity in the previous centuries had a massive impact on West African societies. No mention here, you will observe, of the 1,500 British sailors who lost their lives in the 19th century fighting to put an end to the slave trade in Africa. No mention either that one of the chief aims of the British assault on Benin in 1897 was to put an end to the slave trade there. The British disapproved of the slave trade. Benin was one of the last states in Africa which still refused at the end of the 19th century to abolish the slave trade and also do away with the awful human sacrifices for which the slaves were often used. This was nothing to do with the transatlantic slave trade. Things like human sacrifice and slavery were just old African customs, and in Benin they insisted on maintaining the old customs, despite the British having told them that this was a terrible way to carry on. In Benin City, slaves were kept in cages before being killed in various dreadful ways. When the British forces approached the city of Benin, this was after a British trade delegation had been massacred. Over 200 people were killed. When the British got quite ticked off about it, it gave them an excuse to put an end to slavery in Benin. Here's what a doctor who accompanied the British expedition to Benin City wrote afterward. As we neared Benin City, we passed several human sacrifices. Live women slaves, gagged and pegged on their backs to the ground, the abdominal wall being cut in the form of a cross and the uninjured gut hanging out. These poor women were allowed to die like this in the sun. Men slaves, with their hands tied at the back and feet lashed together, also gagged, were lying about. As we neared the city, sacrificed human beings were lying in the path and bush, even in the king's compound. The sight and stench of them was awful. Dead and mutilated bodies were everywhere. Ending such horrors was one of the things the British wished to do across the whole of Africa. You will find, incidentally, that a myth is current that the city of Benin was somehow a sophisticated place which rivaled the cities of Europe. It was not. It consisted of mud huts surrounded by heaps of mud in lines with ditches on the other side, a little like the hill forts which were found in Britain thousands of years ago. Africa, though, was still at that time in the mud age. Part of the myth is that the supposed walls of Benin were more extensive or grander or larger in volume than the Great Wall of China, and indeed one of the wonders of the ancient world. The only reference ever given for this statement is the 1974 edition of the Guinness Book of Records. There certainly seems to be no archaeological excavation backing up this idea, and I'm very suspicious when everything I read about these supposedly mighty walls uses the same identical words from a 50-year-old copy of the Guinness Book of Records. They were made of mud. They do not exist now, and it all sounds to me like nonsense. Britain went to the place which was built of mud, where slavery was a way of life and human sacrifice routinely practiced. The people who lived there at that time were illiterate, and the only art they possessed was casting brass sculptures. When the British left 60 years later, they had turned this awful spot into a modern, civilised country. That is something to be proud of. And instead of moaning now about those lousy chunks of brass, I'd like to hear the people of Edo State in Nigeria thank the British for what they did for them.